The Farrells seemed perfect on the outside. Carl, a big shot in business, was married to Natalie, who kept house. Her kid Vicky lived with them in a fancy place. Folks thought they had it all. But under the nice lawns and fancy parties, something dark was growing. It would drag them into a mess of wrong love, backstabbing, and in the end, blood. What started as normal marriage problems turned into a scary story. A stepdad fell for his stepdaughter. It all blew up in a fight that left someone dead and everyone's lives wrecked. Carl met Natalie at a big party in Philly back in 2010. He was 35, smart, and climbing the money ladder. She was 32, divorced with a little girl, fixing up rich people's houses. Everyone watched them fall for each other fast. Carl liked how classy and smart Natalie was. She saw him as her ticket to the good life after a rough first marriage. 6 months later, Carl proposed marriage to Natalie, offering her a brilliant diamond ring that their friends envied. The couple wed at the elite Rittenhouse Hotel, making it the season's most talked-about event. Natalie's 7-year-old daughter, Vicky, was the flower girl, smiling brightly as she watched her mother marry the man who would become her stepfather. In the beginning, the Farrells appeared to flourish. Carl's career advanced rapidly, leading to a partnership at his firm. Natalie embraced her new role as a corporate wife, organizing dinner parties and charity functions that established their place in high society. She pampered Vicky, providing her with the best education and extravagant holidays. However, as their new life together became routine, problems surfaced in their marriage. Carl's extended work hours and frequent business trips left Natalie feeling abandoned. Having given up her own career to support his, she found herself increasingly alone in their large house. Natalie's efforts to revive their romance met with indifference from Carl, who seemed more focused on his work than his wife. Their once lively conversations turned into brief exchanges about household matters and Vicky's school activities. By Vicky's high school years, the Farrells' marriage was mostly a facade. They slept in different rooms, explaining to curious friends that Carl's snoring was the cause. Their interactions were polite but distant, more like business associates than a married couple. Natalie immersed herself in volunteer work and her role as Vicky's mother, living through her daughter's accomplishments and social life. Carl buried himself further in his work, taking on more responsibilities and spending less time at home. Neither wanted to admit failure and file for divorce. Their fear of scandal, attachment to their comfortable lifestyle, and concern for Vicky's well-being kept them trapped in their loveless marriage. Unbeknownst to them, the seemingly perfect image they had worked so hard to uphold was about to shatter in a way neither could have foreseen. As Vicky transitioned from an inquisitive child into a stunning young woman, the balance within the Farrell family began to subtly shift. Now at 18 and on the verge of starting college, Vicky had not only inherited her mother's elegance, but also carried the lively spirit of her biological father. Her relationship with her mother had always been close, though at times strained by Natalie's habit of being overprotective and trying to live vicariously through her daughter's milestones. With Carl, the situation had always been more complicated. In the beginning of his marriage to Natalie, he played the role of the devoted stepfather, showing up for her performances and helping her with schoolwork. However, as his marriage to Natalie began to lose its spark, so did his involvement in Vicky's life. That pattern shifted dramatically during her senior year of high school. Approaching 50 and possibly reflecting on his own aging, Carl seemed to develop a renewed focus on his stepdaughter. He proudly attended her dance shows, smiling from the audience, and engaged in lengthy discussions about her future college plans, offering guidance on her studies and career ambitions. At first, Natalie was relieved to see Carl making an effort to be more present, hoping their shared attention to Vicky might repair the widening rift in their relationship. She encouraged the growing closeness between Carl and Vicky, believing it to be a sign of healing, but as time passed, Natalie couldn't shake a growing unease. There was something off in the way Carl's gaze lingered on Vicky and in how their conversations abruptly stopped whenever she entered the room. Vicky, meanwhile, felt a growing attraction to Carl that both thrilled and unsettled her. The way he paid attention to her made her feel acknowledged in ways she hadn't experienced before. She began putting more thought into her appearance whenever she knew he'd be home, subtly seeking his presence under the pretense of needing guidance with college applications or financial matters. The air in the household grew thick with tension. Mealtimes became fraught with silent stares and veiled comments. As Natalie observed her husband and daughter draw closer, she felt increasingly alienated, as if their connection was shutting her out entirely. As graduation loomed on the horizon, the atmosphere in the Farrell home was charged with unresolved emotions and festering grudges. No one could have foreseen the imminent eruption or the disastrous consequences it would unleash. The line between stepfatherly care and something far more dangerous was steadily blurring. A boundary was irrevocably crossed one stormy April night, mere weeks before Vicky's graduation. Natalie had left town for a charity function, leaving Carl and Vicky alone together. They sat down to watch a movie, a bottle of wine between them. Carl rationalized that at 18, Vicky was old enough for a few drinks with her stepfather's oversight. As the rain poured outside and the wine loosened their tongues, the tension between them grew undeniable. Emboldened by the alcohol and the charged atmosphere, Vicky admitted she had always been attracted to Carl. Instead of dismissing her confession as a father figure should, Carl, clouded by loneliness and impaired judgment, confessed to having developed feelings of his own. One touch led to another, and before long they were tangled together on the couch, years of repressed attraction igniting into a heated encounter. The next morning, hit with a mix of shame, confusion, and the excitement of crossing a line they never should have. Carl and Vicky promised each other it was a one-time thing, a mistake caused by loneliness and alcohol. But once the barrier was broken, there was no going back. Glances turned into secret kisses, touches under the dinner table, and hidden texts planning their next meetings. They found ways to justify what they were doing. After all, Carl wasn't Vicky's biological father. Natalie had been cold and distant for years. They told themselves they were adults and love couldn't be wrong. Yet the guilt kept creeping in, especially for Vicky. She noticed the hurt in her mother's eyes, the growing suspicion. She knew the damage this would cause if it came to light, but the thrill of their secret affair was too strong for her to walk away. Carl, on the other hand, kept his actions separate, just like he did with everything else in his life. Around Natalie, he played the part of the distant but dutiful husband. At work, he maintained his image as a perfect professional. But when he was with Vicky, he let himself feel something he thought was long gone. As the weeks went by, their encounters grew more frequent and risky. They met in a rundown motel just outside of town, pretending it was a college tour. They shared heated moments in Carl's car, parked far from prying eyes. Each time they swore it would be the last. Each time they were pulled back in, unable to resist the force of their secret relationship. As spring faded into summer, their lies started closing in around them, threatening to trap everyone involved. The affair only grew more intense as Vicky's first year of college got closer. The thought of being apart seemed to fuel their need for each other, adding desperation to every meeting. They took even bigger risks, ignoring any sense of caution. Carl found more and more reasons to drive the 2 hours to her campus, using any excuse to keep their dangerous connection alive. Carl started fabricating stories about business meetings nearby, but in truth, he spent long afternoons in Vicky's dorm room tangled up with her. Vicky, on the other hand, lied about study groups and extracurriculars to explain her frequent weekend trips home. Their deceit started to affect their other relationships. Carl became even more withdrawn from Natalie, struggling to face her without guilt eating at him. He buried himself in work, using it as a cover for his frequent absences. Meanwhile, Vicky found it hard to bond with her college peers, always keeping her dark secret hidden. The affair started changing who they were. Fueled by his secret relationship with Vicky, Carl began focusing on his appearance. He signed up for a gym membership, bought new clothes, and even considered getting hair restoration. His co-workers noticed his sudden energy and assumed he had finally found a better balance between his personal life and work. Vicky, meanwhile, was torn between excitement and shame. She did well in her classes, channeling her conflicted emotions into her studies, but her social life took a hit. She pushed away the advances of classmates, unable to entertain the idea of a normal relationship while involved with her stepfather. There were several close calls that should have been warnings. Natalie almost caught them together in a compromising situation in the pool house, but a timely phone call delayed her return home just in time. Another time, one of Vicky's dorm mates saw Carl leaving her room early in the morning, leading to awkward questions Vicky barely managed to dodge. Despite these near disasters, both Carl and Vicky convinced themselves they could keep their secret forever. They even started whispering about a future together, talking about the day when they could finally be open about their relationship. Carl mentioned divorcing Natalie and starting a new life with Vicky after she graduated from college. Vicky fantasized about a perfect wedding, conveniently ignoring the chaos it would unleash on her mother. As their imagined future grew more elaborate, so did the layers of deception they needed to maintain their current lives. Carl's finances started drawing unwanted attention at home, with Natalie questioning the rise in business expenses and unexplained cash withdrawals. Vicky, though still doing well academically, began to struggle as the strain of living a double life wore her down. The pressure kept building, and the cracks in their fragile facade widened with each passing day. Yet they pressed on, believing every secret encounter justified their actions and thinking their love was worth any sacrifice. What they didn't realize was that the real cost would be far greater than they ever anticipated, and the reckoning was coming much sooner than they expected. It was during a casual lunch with her friend Heidi that Natalie first felt the stirrings of suspicion. Heidi, always one to share the latest gossip, casually mentioned seeing Carl and Vicky deep in conversation at a local cafe. It was a time when Vicky should have been at college and Carl was supposedly working. Heidi's description of their body language, leaning in close, hands touching, sent a cold wave of fear through Natalie. She laughed it off, changing the topic, but the seed of doubt had been planted. From that moment, Natalie started watching her husband and daughter more closely. She noticed the way their eyes lingered on each other, the private jokes they shared, the excuses they always seemed to find for being alone together. As the clues piled up, Natalie found herself stuck in denial, unable to face the possibility of what was happening. Yet with each day, the truth she didn't want to acknowledge was creeping closer, ready to burst into the open and destroy everything in its path. The day Natalie's life unraveled began like any other. The air was thick with the heat of June, hinting at the possibility of summer storms. Natalie had plans to meet up with friends for lunch, but when they canceled last minute, she found herself with an unexpected free afternoon. On impulse, she decided to surprise Carl at his office, maybe suggest a spontaneous date night to revive the fading spark in their relationship. But when she arrived, Carl was nowhere to be found. His assistant, clearly caught off guard by Natalie's sudden appearance, nervously mentioned that Mr. Farrell had left early, supposedly due to a family emergency. A chill ran through Natalie. There was no family emergency she knew of. Her hands shaking, she pulled out her phone and opened the tracking app she had installed weeks earlier in a paranoid moment. Carl's location popped up, not at home or a hospital, but at an unfamiliar address on the outskirts of town. The drive to that location was a blur, Natalie barely registering the passing scenery as her mind raced through countless horrifying possibilities. When she arrived, she found herself at a rundown motel, the kind that rented rooms by the hour. Carl's car sat parked in the lot. She sat in her own car, frozen, torn between confronting the truth or turning back, pretending she hadn't seen a thing. Before she could decide, another vehicle pulled in, Vicky's old Honda. Natalie's heart sank as she watched her daughter rush across the parking lot, heading straight for one of the motel rooms. The door opened and Carl's silhouette stood clearly in the doorway before Vicky slipped inside. Natalie sat there in stunned disbelief, her mind unable to fully comprehend what her eyes had just seen. Seconds dragged into minutes as she stared at the closed door, desperately hoping it was all some kind of mistake, praying for any explanation other than the gut-wrenching betrayal unfolding before her. Acting more on instinct than reason, Natalie finally stepped out of her car. She approached the door and raised her hand to knock, but hesitated, her fists trembling in midair. From inside, she caught the sound of muffled laughter, Vicky's light musical giggle mixed with Carl's deeper chuckle. The warmth and closeness of it felt like a knife twisting in her gut. Taking a deep breath, Natalie braced herself and knocked sharply. The laughter inside stopped abruptly, replaced by hurried, panicked whispers. She knocked again, harder this time, her voice cracking as she called out. The silence felt endless before she heard movement from within. The door opened slowly to reveal Carl, his hair disheveled and shirt unevenly buttoned. Behind him stood Vicky, her face a mix of guilt and fear. As Natalie's eyes darted between her husband and her daughter, the weight of their betrayal hit her full force. Her already fragile world collapsed entirely in that moment. The tension in the cramped motel room was suffocating as she stepped inside, the air thick with unspoken words. For a long, unbearable moment, no one said a word. The only sounds were the hum of the old air conditioner and the rapid pounding of Natalie's heartbeat echoing in her ears. Carl was the first to break the silence, his voice strained as he tried to explain. Natalie cut him off, her tone unsettlingly calm. Carl stepped toward her, trying to shield Vicky behind him. "Natalie, this isn't Vicky's fault," he pleaded. A bitter laugh escaped Natalie's lips. The argument escalated quickly, years of buried resentment and betrayal boiling over. Accusations flew. Natalie accused Carl of manipulating Vicky, exploiting her youth and vulnerability. Carl pushed back, claiming it was true love, insisting Vicky was an adult and capable of making her own choices. Caught between her mother and the man she believed she loved, Vicky tried to calm the situation. She begged Natalie to understand, insisting Carl had never manipulated her and that their feelings were mutual. But Natalie was past the point of listening. To her, this was the ultimate betrayal, both as a wife and as a mother. As the argument reached a boiling point, Natalie noticed Carl moving subtly toward the bedside table. The glint of metal caught her eye, and a wave of fear surged through her as she realized he was reaching for something, the gun he always kept for protection. everything seemed to slow down. Natalie lunged at Carl, determined to stop him before he could do something irreversible. Vicky, misreading her mother's sudden move as an attack on Carl, tried to step in. In the chaos that followed, the gun discharged. The deafening crack of the shot filled the small room. For a moment, silence hung heavy, then Vicky collapsed to the floor, a dark red stain spreading across her shirt. Natalie's scream pierced the stillness. Carl stood frozen, the gun slipping from his hands as Natalie scrambled to stop the blood pouring from her daughter's wound. The enormity of what had happened began to hit them. Their secret was no longer hidden, and the fallout was far worse than any of them could have ever imagined. The sound of the gunshot drew a swift response from law enforcement. Within minutes, the motel parking lot was swarming with flashing lights as police cars and an ambulance arrived. Inside room 114, first responders found a scene of devastation, Vicky lying on the floor, clinging to life. While Natalie fought to stop the bleeding, Carl Farrell sat slumped in a corner, his gaze vacant, the gun still lying on the floor where he dropped it. Natalie, drenched in her daughter's blood, shifted between pleading with the paramedics and breaking down in sobs. Detective John Donovan, a seasoned officer with the local police force, took control as Vicky was rushed to the hospital. His grim job now was to piece together what had unfolded in that motel room. The evidence painted a clear enough picture. One gunshot, one victim, and the weapon registered to Carl Farrell. But the motive was far from clear. When Donovan first questioned Natalie and Carl, their stories were muddled, neither able to provide a coherent account through their shock and distress. As word of the shooting spread, the usually quiet community was left in disbelief. The Farrells had always been seen as the ideal family, successful, respected, and active in charitable events. The notion that such violence could erupt from within their home seemed impossible to neighbors and friends. Over the following days, while Vicky clung to life in the ICU, Detective Donovan and his team worked relentlessly to uncover the truth. They pored over phone records, interviewed acquaintances, and examined the family's history. What emerged was a much darker picture of the Farrells than anyone had suspected. As Donovan dug deeper into the case, the polished image of the Farrell family rapidly unraveled. Interviews with close friends and co-workers revealed a marriage long devoid of love, held together by little more than appearances and financial interests. Heidi Whitaker, Natalie's closest confidant, offered key insights into the months leading up to the tragedy. She shared details of tearful lunches where Natalie had expressed growing fears of Carl's infidelity, though she never imagined the full extent of his betrayal. Carl's colleagues spoke of a man who seemed revitalized in recent months, often mentioning a new love in his life. They assumed it was a typical midlife affair, never suspecting that the woman in question was his own stepdaughter. The most incriminating information, however, came from Vicky's college roommate. Once assured that her statements would be kept confidential, Alma handed over a series of text messages Vicky had sent, filled with love-struck words and giddy excitement about her affair with Carl, reflecting the naive passion of someone convinced they were in true love. For investigators, this digital evidence was a breakthrough. Subpoenaed phone records revealed hundreds of calls and texts between Carl and Vicky, often at odd hours. Financial records painted an even clearer picture. Expensive gifts like jewelry, designer clothes, and even a car, all from Carl to Vicky, and all kept secret from Natalie. There were also records of hotel stays and weekends away disguised as business trips or visits to Vicky's college. As more evidence surfaced, the full scope of Carl and Vicky's deception unfolded. This was not a fleeting romance or a brief lapse in judgment. Their affair had spanned over a year, carefully planned and expertly concealed from Natalie and everyone else. The discovery of this affair changed everything about the motel room shooting. What had initially seemed like a tragic accident during a heated argument now appeared more like a potential crime of passion. As Vicky began her slow recovery in the hospital, a haunting question lingered. Who had actually pulled the trigger? Was it Carl, desperate to silence Vicky and protect himself? Could it have been Natalie, enraged by the shocking betrayal of her husband and daughter? Or had Vicky herself, overwhelmed with guilt when faced with her mother, fired the shot? Detective Donovan suspected the truth might be far more tangled than anyone initially realized. After reviewing the mountain of evidence collected by Donovan and his team, the district attorney personally stepped in to take control of the case. The district attorney made the decision to charge both Carl and Natalie Farrell with attempted murder. Once a symbol of corporate success, Carl now looked gaunt and broken in his orange prison jumpsuit. His defense, spearheaded by the high-profile lawyer Donald Thompson, claimed the shooting was nothing more than a tragic accident, an unfortunate result of a struggle over the gun during a heated family dispute. Natalie, in contrast, seemed to have aged significantly in the short time since the incident. Her attorney portrayed her as a victim, a woman deeply betrayed by both her husband and daughter who had acted in self-defense, believing Carl was reaching for the gun to silence them permanently. The lingering question of Vicky's role in the incident weighed heavily on the case. As the only other witness to what happened that day, her testimony could determine the outcome. Yet Vicky, still recovering from her injuries, chose to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights, refusing to testify against either of her parents. In the end, Carl accepted a plea deal. In a quiet courtroom, he pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As he was taken away in handcuffs, he exchanged a final glance with Natalie, a look filled with the unspoken pain, betrayal, and regret that had ripped their family apart. Natalie, after the charges against her were dismissed, walked out of the courthouse a free woman, but one forever altered by the events that had unfolded. Within a few months, she sold the family home and moved far away, trying to escape the judgmental looks and whispers that followed her everywhere. Meanwhile, Vicky, once physically healed, faced the overwhelming challenge of addressing the emotional and psychological wounds left by the ordeal. She dropped out of college and entered intensive therapy, trying to process the trauma of the shooting and the tangled feelings tied to her relationship with Carl. Her bond with Natalie remained fractured, the betrayal between them creating a deep rift that seemed impossible to close. Though the Farrell case eventually faded from the national headlines, its effects were far-reaching. It became a stark warning, a grim reminder that beneath even the most flawless family facade, dark secrets can fester. The community, still shaken by the violence that erupted among them, took steps to confront domestic issues, launching programs aimed at preventing family crises and encouraging healthier relationships.